So this video is not going to be a Bertrand Russell-esque rundown of all of the arguments in favour of Christianity and the reasons why I reject them. Firstly, because there are a lot better videos out there on YouTube doing exactly that. And secondly, because that's a little bit too detailed for what I really want to talk about. And I kind of want to do an overview, I guess, of the sort of broad brush reasons for why I'm not a Christian. So in my previous video, why I'm an atheist, I explained that basically I was raised without any belief in gods, and that was mainly the reason why I haven't acquired any. And in this video I wanted to talk about specifically why I never converted to Christianity. And there's a few reasons for this. I mean, firstly, being raised in a atheistic household, if you want to put it that way, meant that the burden of proof was squarely where it belonged on the Christian. I know that many people who were raised Christian or of other faith often struggle to put the burden of proof where it needs to be. They struggle to see how much of an extraordinary claim religion in general are, and Christianity in particular, and they struggle to sort of see the kind of evidence that is required of that. It's being said quite frequently, and I think there is a lot of truth to it, that most people don't come to religion for purely rational reasons. And so having been raised without a belief in God, that meant that I really was only going to be amenable to well-made rational arguments in favour of it. Now, I'm not an expert on a lot of the arguments. I'm probably better versed than a lot of people. I've done university level philosophy of religion courses, and I've shown a keen interest. So the broad brush reason why none of this is that all arguments for God that I've ever come across have got major flaws in them. So the rational argumentation, I think, generally fails. And to make the point a little bit clearer, I think, is that I don't feel the need for myself to investigate every single claim, because, to be honest, I feel like if there was a knockdown argument for God, it really would become well known. The Christians, I mean, if there was a knockdown philosophical argument for the existence of a Christian God, the Christians would be promoting it endlessly, and they simply aren't. Christians promote a range of different arguments for God. This to me suggests that none of them are particularly strong on their own. The arguments for God have evolved and changed over the years. They're not presenting the same argument now as they were 100 years ago. This to me suggests that the arguments they were presenting 100, 200, 500 years ago were not particularly strong. Otherwise, that's the same argument. If we compare this to atheism, on the other hand, the objections that atheists have raised has been fairly consistent from actually more than the last 2,000 years. Simple arguments around the burden of proof not being met. So I know this isn't a sort of an absolutely sort of rock solidly logical refutation of Christianity. I mean, it's quite conceivable Christianity might be true, and we just haven't come across the rock solid, rational argument for it. However, I do feel that is unlikely. And partially it's unlikely due to the nature of the God that most Christians believe in. So the real issue I have also, I guess then comes down to two things. So the main two reasons why I was never able to convert was the argument from divine hiddenness and the argument from evil. So this is not a new thing. I probably stumbled upon them in my own crude way before realising that this was a common argument that many people have made. So the argument from divine hiddenness basically says that the Christian God, as it is conceived of by most people, and as it is written by in the Bible, is a God who is supposed to be present in our lives. And I simply have not felt that presence. I've not seen any real evidence. I've not really seen any evidence of him working in my life and doing anything in particular in my life. Religious people will say that they see plenty of evidence in their lives. And I guess if I'm willing to accept that, then they really need to be willing to accept that there is no evidence of him working in my life. I think partially due to the foibles of human perception, Um, we tend to see the things that fit within our dominant view. I mean, there's confirmation bias. But even that aside, I've not made any willful attempt to dismiss God. I've been quite open to his existence, and there's been times in my past when I've, not been particularly, actually most of my life I've not been particularly committed to atheism. I've been quite keen on the idea that there is a God that would balance the cosmic scales of justice and all the rest of it. And so I'd be quite open to seeing his work in my life. And yet, as far as I can tell, there hasn't been. There simply hasn't been anything that sort of cries out for some kind of religious explanation. Everything in my life and the things that people have done around me and the things that I've done seem sort of adequately explained as just people doing people things. And so there's that. So God seems to be hidden. So maybe he exists, but if he does exist, he's not the kind of God that I have heard Christians talking about. I mean, there might be some Christians out there that I've never come across who believe in a God that's non-interventionist or whatever. But really, as far as I can see, that's not a God of the Bible, and that's not the God that my Christian friends and sort of associates claim exists. I think the other knockdown argument for me, is the argument from evil as well. Either way, you try and square the circle. And I've actually made a video about that, about some of the sort of more difficult consequences of typical sort of Christian responses to the problem of evil. That is, so the responses that Christians have to the problem of evil in themselves entail even more difficult consequences. But that said, I think the bold statement of the problem of evil, that we cannot have an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God and evil in the world, I think that still stands. There really aren't any good responses that don't somehow move you away from the Christian concept of God. I mean, the God that the vast majority of Christians that I've ever come across believes in is not compatible with the world as we see it. Just the world that I've experienced. I'm not even talking about sort of grand meta-analyses of the world or some kind of scientific evidence, etc. I'm just talking about my everyday experience. My everyday experience of the world is not compatible with a Christian God. And on another level, requires no God to explain it. And so I guess in my own personal life, God has not met the burden of proof. And that's the main reason I'm not a Christian. Now, I quite enjoy the sort of the arguments against the literal Bible and the debunking of these sort of religious arguments, etc., etc. But for me, that's more entertainment and sport rather than a sort of a reason not to believe. Because I think, or at least this sort of, I guess, maybe bolsters my atheism, if that was it. I mean, I'm intellectually open to new arguments for the existence of God, but there has been a stunning failure of Christians to provide compelling arguments for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, I find it absolutely amazing that the same arguments are being made 500 years later. Arguments that were discredited at the time they were being made. Aquinas' 5 ways. I mean, it's not like we've only just realised why these arguments fail. I mean, they long known to be failures. I mean, even around the time that they were proposed, they were not universally accepted as proving God. There have been objections raised, and these objections have never really been dealt with. And yet, these are the arguments that Christians are still making. I mean, appalling argument. I mean, William Lane Craig, for goodness sake, is still advancing things like the ontological argument with a straight face. And if this is the best that Christians can come up with, that really does, to me, in a strictly Bayesian sense, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. The Christian God should have evidence for his existence. The Bible plainly says so, that God acts in the world and we should be able to detect this. And the fact that we don't, I think, strongly argues against it. Now, I think this in itself is not a rock-solid argument against theism in general, but certainly against the Christian God and most gods that I think that many other religions would propose. And so I think on some level that's probably, I think for me that is the most compelling argument against Christianity and the reason why I've never converted. I might convert if a strong philosophical argument was made, but I still wonder how you could possibly square the God, the Christian God as commonly conceived, with the reality of the world around us. Now, that said, as far as I can tell, there are really only three sort of internally consistent logical positions to hold on the matter of the Christian God. So either you're a biblical literalist, and that is an internally consistent proposition. The God of the Bible exists, that the Bible is essentially true in its parts that are supposed to be taken literally, and I know there's some debate around that, but the general fundamentalist position that it is essentially, the historical parts are essentially historically true, and that it's the absolute word of God, etc., etc. Now, that position does not stand the test of looking at the world around us. I mean, the world around us we see is completely different from the world we should see if the Bible is true. And you can hand wave that around, and you can do all the kind of crazy stuff that the Ken Hams of the world do to try and explain how the Bible is literally true and it fits in with everything. But essentially, the vast majority of people understand that that's not true. That what we know about the world the universe flatly contradicts what the Bible says. And so once you've discarded that position, I think the only other internally consistent position is a position of revelation. That is where you personally have an experience of God. And so you can believe in a God through your own personal experience, and you can then have some kind of nuanced belief about the Bible. And by nuanced, I mean vague. So the bits of the Bible that your experience of God has revealed to you to be true are true, and the bits that your personal experience of God has revealed to you to be false are false. I think that's a fairly internally consistent position. So those bits, so your personal experience of God is what trumps everything else. And there is a religious tradition of that. And I would suspect that actually a fair number of religious people would go down that path and say that, their experience of God or Jesus is what their faith is grounded in. And if it contradicts the Bible, then they would go with God or Jesus over the Bible every time. That might not necessarily be what the preachers are saying at the pulpit, due to the revolutionary anti-authoritarian kind of foundation for that. But I would just, a fair number of the Christians I've talked to, that's kind of the position they take. They don't actually want to have to confront that potential conflict, but that's probably where they would go. Now, firstly, that's not compelling to me because your religious experience tells me nothing, is not evidence for me. And my lack of religious experience and my lack of revelation is strong evidence against a Christian God as far as I'm concerned. But I can understand why that would be appealing. I mean, I don't think it's a particularly well-founded position on religion. But there are ways around it. I mean, a lot of those Christians also would then probably concede that their God is the same as everybody else's God, and that they're all receiving imperfect revelations due to their imperfect human nature, and that's why there's conflict, but it's not about God, and blah, 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 blah. And there's ways around that. I'd say fine, but that's not compelling for me. And then I think the only other internally consistent position is then, other than that, is atheism. That these gods simply don't exist. And some kind of, And so I guess those are, the biblical literalism I think is completely out. The revelation thing, I think there's good arguments for why revelation is an appalling, revelation is an appalling way of defining truth in the world. We know this because revelation is only ever about as true as people's understanding of the world is without revelation. That is, people only seem to get things revealed to them by God that they would already know, or are sort of vague pronouncements. It's kind of like when John Edwards talks to the dead. They only ever seem to come out with banalities and things that we would already know. And it seems no different in prayer and revelation. So we know that revelation is an appalling way of finding out about the truth about the world, and therefore I'm not quite sure what Christians are sort of think they're claiming when they say that they receive revelations from God. But again, I'm not a Christian because I've never received these revelations. And so to me, that's it. That's the sum total of why I'm not a Christian. Firstly, because the rational arguments all fail. And they all have problems with them, and on a sort of a more meta level, a Christian God that could only be proven through philosophical argument because it has no presence in the world, or there is no evidence for that God, to me is not a Christian God. That is not the God of the Bible, but that's also not the God. That's not Jesus. Jesus came to earth and did things, and so the rational arguments all fail. And even if they succeeded, a purely rational argument without evidence would not be that compelling to me. The amount of evidence is zero. The evidence for the Christian God is basically zero. I've never received a revelation, despite being open to it, and therefore the only conclusion I can come to is that, as far as I can tell, there is no Christian God. I'm open to be convinced otherwise. I'm open to evidence, but there you have it. So that is why I'm not a Christian. See you next time.